What if I told you some of the most advanced empires in history built their power not just on science or culture, but on fear, broken families, and erased civilizations? History books love to talk about the Golden Age, but buried beneath the glowing pages lies something far darker. Policies so brutal, they make medieval Europe look merciful. Imagine entire communities watching their children dragged away, temples that stood for 1,000 years reduced to rubble in a single night, and traditions so old they vanished from memory, almost like they never existed. The shocking part? These weren't just random acts of cruelty, they were systematic, calculated, and recorded by the conquerors themselves. And yet, most people have never even heard the full story. But that's only the beginning. It started with something that looked less like war and more like a tax. Every few years in Christian villages across the Balkans, the quiet streets would erupt in terror. Families weren't losing their crops or their gold. This time they were losing their sons. Ottoman officials called it the Devshirme, or blood tax, but locals knew it as something far worse, a state-sanctioned kidnapping. Boys as young as 8 were torn from their homes, lined up like cattle, and inspected for strength, intelligence, or even just good looks. Parents had no choice but to hand them over, and if they resisted, whole families could be wiped out in a single night. Once taken, the children were marched hundreds of miles to Istanbul. There, their names, their languages, even their very identities were erased. They were told their Christian families had abandoned them. They were given new masters, new loyalties, and turned into elite janissaries, the empire's most feared soldiers. Here's the cruel twist: these same boys would return years later, not as sons but as weapons, former Christians now leading conquests against Christian lands. Generations grew up in terror, hiding their sons, even injuring them to avoid selection. But the system was relentless. Historical records suggest up to 1 million children were stolen this way. And the most chilling part, many of these boys genuinely came to believe they owed everything to the empire that enslaved them. But this was just one piece of a much bigger machine of domination. If the stolen children of Europe were the empire's soldiers, Africa became its hunting ground for human labor. For over 1,400 years, long before and long after the Atlantic slave trade, Islamic markets fueled a system even more horrifying. Conservative estimates put the number at 11 to 17 million Africans enslaved, but many historians believe the real toll was far higher. What made it uniquely brutal wasn't just the scale, it was the method. Unlike in the Americas, where enslaved populations could sometimes grow through families, here reproduction was deliberately cut off. Up to 90% of enslaved men were castrated. The procedure was so deadly that most never survived it, but those who did became eunuchs, stripped not only of freedom, but of the chance to ever build a family again. In places like Aswan, Egypt, castration centers operated like factories, processing thousands every year. Chroniclers of the time described this as casually as if they were talking about grain markets. The survivors were scattered across empires as guards, domestic servants, or laborers. Women, on the other hand, were taken for harems, concubinage, and markets, where they were displayed publicly, valued for beauty above all else. Families in targeted regions were so terrified, some scarred their daughters' faces or kept them hidden indoors for life, just to make them less desirable to raiders. And yet, this machine never slowed. For centuries, wave after wave of young men and women were drained from their homelands, so thoroughly that many African communities never recovered. But the story doesn't end with slavery alone. Because when the sword wasn't enough, the caliphates had another weapon: destroying entire religions from the inside out. Conquest wasn't just about land or bodies, it was about souls. When armies marched into new territories, the choice wasn't always convert or die. Instead, a far more subtle weapon was used: the dhimmi system. On paper, non-Muslims could keep their faith, but in reality, they were forced into a cage of humiliation and financial ruin. The infamous jizya tax drained families dry, sometimes costing the equivalent of months of income. And the way it was collected? Designed to crush pride. Non-Muslims had to present themselves publicly, sometimes struck or forced to kneel while handing over their payment. It wasn't just about money. It was about sending a message. You are less. You are tolerated, not respected. But even if a family could endure the taxes, there was another attack: the systematic destruction of their spiritual homes. In Egypt, ancient Coptic monasteries, centuries old, were smashed apart. In Persia, sacred fire temples that had burned for over 1,000 years were extinguished forever. Priests were executed or forced to abandon their faith. And in India, entire landscapes of faith were wiped out. Mahmud of Ghazni, one of history's most infamous conquerors, bragged in his own chronicles that he destroyed over 50,000 temples. The holiest sites of Hinduism weren't just desecrated, they were demolished, their fragments recycled into the very mosques built on their ruins. This wasn't random violence, it was psychological warfare. By erasing the physical symbols of gods and traditions, conquerors convinced millions that resistance itself was meaningless. And once faith collapsed, identity followed. But religion wasn't the only target. That's exactly what Islamic caliphates perfected: cultural erasure on a massive scale. When Arab armies entered Alexandria, they didn't just take the city. They destroyed what remained of its legendary library, once the beating heart of ancient knowledge. In Persia, royal archives and centuries of scholarship were burned to ash. Even languages weren't safe. Arabic was imposed as the tongue of power, administration, and religion. Local languages were slowly strangled. The ancient Egyptian language, Coptic, the last link to the pharaohs, survived only in church rituals before disappearing from everyday life. And it didn't stop there. Festivals that had defined communities for centuries were outlawed. Persia's Nowruz, a celebration older than Islam itself, was banned in many regions. Hindu festivals were crushed under occupation. Traditions weren't just frowned upon, they were declared illegal, un-Islamic, and erased. Monuments were demolished, temples were renamed, entire cities given new identities. The message was chillingly clear: your past has no value, only ours matters. Education was transformed too. Generations of children who once studied local traditions were instead funneled into madrasas, taught only the culture and religion of their conquerors. The chain of memory was broken forever. The result? Ancient civilizations like Egypt, which had survived Greeks, Persians, and Romans, finally vanished under Islamic conquest. Persia, once one of the intellectual powerhouses of the ancient world, was reduced to silence. And perhaps the darkest irony, we only know about many of these erased cultures today because archaeologists dig fragments out of the ground. But while culture and religion were under assault, another battlefield was opening. One fought not with swords, but with hunger and money. If armies could break bodies, and cultural erasure could break memory, then money was the final blade that cut deepest. The caliphates mastered economic warfare, not just taking wealth, but making sure conquered peoples could never rise again. Taxes like the kharaj, the land tax, were deliberately set at crushing levels. In some regions, up to 80% of a farmer's harvest was taken, leaving just enough to survive, but never enough to prosper. And when a family couldn't pay, their land was seized and handed to loyal Muslim settlers. Entire infrastructures were allowed to rot. In Persia, advanced irrigation systems that had fed millions for centuries were left to decay. This wasn't neglect, it was strategy, forcing dependence on new rulers and ensuring locals could never rebuild their former strength. Even trade itself was turned into a weapon. Non-Muslims were blocked from certain professions or taxed into poverty if they tried to compete. Over time, control of commerce shifted completely into the hands of those loyal to the empire, while native populations sank deeper into poverty. Some conquered peoples weren't even taxed in money, but in flesh. The Nubians, for example, were forced to deliver 400 slaves a year to the Fatimid Caliphate, Other groups were required to hand over young men for military service. Human tribute, written into law, drained communities of their future. The goal was never just wealth, it was permanent submission. Starve resistance, crush ambition, and make conversion to Islam not just a religious choice, but the only way to survive. But while the economy was bled dry, another more personal cruelty thrived behind palace walls. If boys were stolen for armies and men were broken for labor, then women bore an entirely different fate, one that unfolded behind locked palace doors. The caliphates institutionalized sexual slavery on a scale history rarely acknowledges. Harems weren't just symbols of wealth or luxury, they were political weapons of domination. The Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid, the same ruler romanticized in the Arabian Nights, kept over 2,000 women in his harem. They weren't willing companions, they were captives, taken from every corner of the empire, stripped of choice, and used as property. Slave markets across Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad openly displayed women, often naked for inspection, their prices rising with their beauty. Some sold for the equivalent of years of wages. Travelers like Ibn Battuta described these markets casually, as though selling human beings was no different than trading spices. The system broke families in ways deeper than death. Parents knew that their daughters, if captured, could vanish into harems forever. Some scarred their own children's faces to protect them. Others hid girls inside homes for life, creating traditions of seclusion that would echo through generations. And unlike wives, who aged into respected status, concubines were disposable, replaced frequently. They created a constant demand for new captives. Ottoman records suggest over 1.5 million women were enslaved for sexual purposes between the 14th and 19th centuries alone. What's even more chilling is that all of this was cloaked in religious legality. Verses about "those whom your right hand possesses" were interpreted as divine permission. Scholars even built complex laws around how these women could be bought, sold, or discarded. But harems were only one face of the cruelty, because behind the glory of conquest, the real prize wasn't just land or power, it was the total annihilation of other people's futures, and the way they achieved that was perhaps the most haunting legacy of all. When you piece it all together, the stolen children, the slave markets, the destroyed temples, the crushed economies, it becomes clear this wasn't random cruelty. It was a system, a machine of domination. Every policy worked together like gears in a clock. Take the strongest sons to fight against their own people, drain the wealth until resistance was impossible. Break the spirit by smashing temples and burning libraries. Strip away language, festivals, and memory until nothing remained but silence. And it worked. Entire civilizations that had survived Rome, Persia, and centuries of invasions disappeared forever under the caliphates. Ancient Christian communities across North Africa, gone. Zoroastrian Persia, once a global power, reduced to a fraction of its former self. Even in India, temples that had stood for thousands of years were wiped out in a single generation. The brilliance, if you can call it that, was in the method. Conquest wasn't just about killing. It was about ensuring no one could rise again. And perhaps the most disturbing truth is this: many of the conquerors didn't even see it as cruelty. Chroniclers of the time, Arab writers themselves, recorded castrations, slave markets, and temple burnings as routine, as ordinary business. That cold normalization is what makes it so chilling, because what's normalized can be repeated. And maybe that's the real warning buried in history. These methods of erasure didn't vanish with the medieval world, they evolved. Today, it may not be swords or harems, but cultures still disappear, histories are still rewritten, and whole peoples are still silenced under the weight of power. The question is, when we see it happening now, will we even recognize it? History remembers the golden age of knowledge, but it forgets the shadow it was built on. The stolen children, the broken families, the vanished civilizations, and that's the cruelest legacy of all.